This interview is sponsored by Grantstone Shoes. Grantstone Shoes is a third-generation family of shoemakers that uses high-quality leather to make very high-quality men's dress shoes and boots at affordable prices. Mo and I each have a pair of these shoes. We think they're good. We've been wearing them for over a month now, trying them out. If you don't believe us, go check out the customer reviews for Grantstone Shoes. They have a lot of 5-star customer reviews. They also have excellent reviews from independent fashion bloggers. And if you like the shoes, enter promo code GOLD, that's GOLD, on the grantstoneshoes.com website for 10% off your order. That's grantstoneshoes.com. Enter promo code GOLD for a 10% off discount. Hi, everyone. It's Jason Biarco of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest to our show. He is senior editor of Casey Research's International Man. He has traveled all over the world with Doug Casey. He's an Italian citizen as well, dual citizenship with U.S. citizen. He has a chartered financial analyst as well. Nick Giambruno, thank you for joining me again.
Hey, Jason, great to be with you again.
Now, Nick, you put out a bunch of prescient pieces recently. We've had a lot of very interesting things related to globalism. It seems the globalism may be a little bit on the retreat. What's your opinion about that when we have evidence of Brexit, Donald Trump winning, and the Italian referendum?
Yes, I think you're exactly correct, Jason. But first, I'd like to take a step back and define globalism, because oftentimes people don't hear this word, they don't know what it means. It's very simple what it means. It just means the centralization of power into a couple of global institutions. That's it. It's really the centralization of power on a global basis. And I think it's a bad thing. I think people who value individual freedom, economic freedom, and freedom in general should think it's a bad thing. But yes, I agree. I think it's on the decline. And we're at an interesting moment in history. And those three things that you just mentioned, Brexit, Trump, and the failure of the Italian referendum, are clear signs that globalism is losing its steam.
Well, I think, there's the elites who want a one-world government, who want the United Nations or IMF or World Bank, these powerful organizations to have more overlap and more control over the global economy. I don't think they're going to give up without a fight. I mean, look what's going on with Brexit. They're still fighting it, the elites in London and in Brussels. You were boots on the ground. You were in Italy. You wrote an article. It got on Zero Hedge a couple days before the Italian referendum. How angry were people in Italy about the referendum? Did they actually are serious about leaving the EU?
Well, here's the thing. It's not just the Italian referendum. To be honest, most Italians don't even know what the referendum was about. They just knew it was basically a vote of confidence in the current pro-EU government. The mechanics and the kind of archaic changes that the referendum was about, most people didn't even understand. But just real quick, the referendum, again, was about centralization of power. It was about taking away the power from the regional and city governments in Italy and concentrating it more in the central government of Italy. So again, I think people who value freedom on all levels should think centralization of power is a bad thing. So on that basis alone, it was worth opposing the Italian referendum. But really, the Italian referendum wasn't about that, because most Italians didn't understand the mechanics of it. It came down to a vote of confidence in the pro-EU, pro-globalist Prime Minister of Matteo Renzi, who has since stepped down. Now, it became that because Renzi, like David Cameron with the Brexit vote, foolishly promised he would resign if his proposed referendum didn't go the way he wanted it to go. So what happened is that he made this promise months in advance when it looked like his referendum would, in fact, succeed. But having spent a number of weeks on the ground in Italy, and I know a thing or two about the country, being an Italian citizen, it was clear that this was not a shoo-in like Matteo Renzi thought it would be. And in fact, as time went on, it became clear that it was, basically a slam dunk that his referendum was not going to pass, and he is going to resign. So what comes next? Well, what you have in Italy is you have a populist party, the 5-Star Movement, led by a comedian. It's kind of interesting because this political party basically started out as a joke. The guy, it's a political party led by a comedian. It started out as a joke a few years ago, but people in Italy have become so frustrated with the mainstream parties that they kind of have the same thing that we do in the U.S. Basically, they have an establishment left and an establishment right, like a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. But they've a lot of Italians have left those mainstream parties to go to populist parties like this Five Star Movement. There are other populist parties too, but it's the biggest one. And what's the populist parties? One of their main planks is they'd like to allow Italians to vote on whether or not to leave, not necessarily the European Union at first, but to leave the euro currency. And I think that would pass because Italy has not had any real economic growth, zero, since it joined the euro in 1999. That's pretty profound. I mean, that's what? That's 17 years of no economic growth, real economic growth. And it's all due to the fact that Italy has become uncompetitive because it's in this monetary union with Germany. If the Five Star Movement or other populist parties are anti-euro too, if these populist parties get into power, and it looks like there's a very good chance they will when the next election happens, Italy could very well leave the euro, and if Italy leaves the euro, Italy's a core member of the euro. France will probably leave, and if Italy and France leave the euro, there is no euro. And if there is no euro, well, that's the main glue that holds the whole European Union together. And you can kind of see how the dominoes will fall. We're still early in the process, but it doesn't look good for the globalists, and it doesn't look good for the Eurocrats. I mean, I repeat myself, but yes.
Yeah, I don't think the globalists are going to give up. They're still fighting this in Brussels and London with the Brexit. They're trying to hijack all the populist movement. The Tea Party movement in the U.S. was hijacked. The Pirate Party, you brought up populist parties. The Pirate Party in Iceland has actually become very popular over there, and that was started as a joke too. So
yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a sign that the ruling establishment that rules the West, which has an ideology of, you said, globalism, it's not working anymore, and we're really in uncharted territory here to see what happens next. Now, I don't know what will happen next. You could have a rise of nationalism, which I would argue is not necessarily a good thing, or you could have power devolve. So if globalism isn't going to work, political power is going to be devolved to maybe the national level. Maybe it'll be devolved even to a smaller unit, which I think would be good. I think decentralization is a good thing. And you can see that happening in Europe, too. I mean, you have the Catalans and the Basque in Spain. You have the Scots in the UK. There are a bunch of different secessionist movements in Italy itself. And you got to remember, these European nation states like Italy. Italy's only been a country for, I don't know, since the mid 1800s. I mean, Italy is not a permanent fixture in the universe. So, very good chance we could see these entities fly apart, not only just in our lifetime, but in the intermediate future.
Yeah, I think that decentralization would be good for freedom, and it would allow more real free markets rather than these crony free trade deals. I mean, these deals that are free trade in name only. They're not, real free trade agreements. They're mostly, corporate bribes and cronyism that go out. I remember listening to Lou Rockwell talk about the NAFTA agreement when he was Ron Paul's chief of staff, and he went to the printer's office in Congress, and he said it was many thousands of pages, and it would have entire paragraphs about, kickbacks and low taxes for each specific corporation. That doesn't sound like a free trade deal to me. It sounds like something that doesn't benefit everyone, only benefits, the people who have the money to spend on lobbying and lawyers. In terms of the European Union, do you think if Italy did leave and went back to the Italian lira, do you think that would prevent maybe bank bailouts then from the Italian banks that are in trouble? Because we know that there's a European banking crisis going on now. We just saw that the Ukraine just nationalized their private bank. They gave a lame-ass excuse, but it was probably because of bad loans. And we know Deutsche Bank is on the ropes. It's going to have to either it's going to need a bailout of some sorts. You can't bail in all these banks. Their derivatives losses and other things are too large. I think the Federal Reserve at some point, because they're, the largest, most powerful central bank in the world, is going to have to do some type of backdoor bailout. What's your opinion, though, on how these European banking system crisis will be dealt with?
Well, Italy is probably the worst, in the worst shape here. If we're looking on a country basis, but the Italian banking system is a mile-high house of cards, and it's just getting wobblier by the day. The fact is that as I mentioned, Italy has had no economic growth for basically 17 years. Well, obviously that is going to translate into problems in the banking system, who have made loans to these businesses that have been rendered uncompetitive because of the euro and in having the same currency as Germany. Now, I don't think. I mean, it's not. Here's what would happen if they went back to the lira. It wouldn't be necessarily sound economics. What are they going to do if they go back to the lira to recapitalize their banking system? They're going to print a lot of liras, and it's going to cause a lot of inflation by nature. So just because they're going back to the lira doesn't mean they're going to embrace the principles of sound finance and sound banking and sound economics. That's not going to happen. They're going to just print a lot of money, which they can't right now because they're in the euro.
Yeah, we know that politicians and central bankers, when in doubt, they start to increase inflation, monetary inflation, and increase taxes. So they're going to look for either new credit bubbles. We see these white papers talking about bail-ins and bailouts. I mean, bail-ins and bailouts are two sides of the same coin. I mean, it's less freedom, it's a tax on savers or a tax on people's assets. So it's a confiscation grab. This brings me to my next point. This is something that's going on now in the world. It seems like the elites are coming out with this global wealth confiscation, cashless society, India demonetization is fitting in there. Now that Donald Trump has won in the United States, I interviewed Danielle DiMartino Booth 2 weeks ago. I was telling you about that before we started recording. She worked at the Federal Reserve for 9 years. She says that the Federal Reserve is going to stop implementing those plans once Donald Trump is actually in office in January. What's your opinion on that? Do you think Donald Trump is going to actually stop, this cashless society and setting up more bailouts and bail-ins?
Well, I think you can't separate the two issues between the unsound banking system, where you have fractional reserve lending practices, where the bank has only a small fraction of capital for all the money it's loaned out, and it's a very unstable situation because if only a few percentage of depositors go and ask for their money back, well, after that, the bank doesn't have the money. So you can't separate the unsound banking system from the war on cash, because what does the war on cash do? The war on cash forces people into the banking system. It is kind of a prop to this unsound banking system, because if you can't use cash, you got to use the banks, and you got to use digital money in the banks, and that props up the fractional reserve banking system. So I don't see any evidence of the war on cash slowing down. I mean, they're really, outside of some calls by some of these so-called intellectuals from Harvard, Ken Rogoff and Larry Summers and these kind of creeps, calling for the elimination of the $100 bill, the $50 bill. I don't need to rehash these arguments. I think your readers are probably quite familiar with why these are bogus arguments about why we need to get rid of these kinds of these bills, these large bills. I don't see the evidence of the war on cash slowing down. I haven't heard these people who. What kind of a person wakes up in the morning and makes it their mission to get rid of the $100 bill? I mean, these are like sociopathic people. These people do not have the best interests of you at heart. And really, they are really sociopathic. But I don't see any evidence and these people are all intertwined with the Fed and the big banks and so forth. So I don't really see any evidence of them changing their thinking, and they're really the rocket fuel behind the war on cash. And let's not forget that inflation is a part of the war on cash, because it eats away the value of the largest bills. Since the 1960s, the $100 bill is the largest bill in existence for Americans. Well, $100 today the purchasing power is worth less than $20 was in the 1960s when the $100 bill became the largest bill. So before that, you also had a $500 bill, a $1,000 bill, and even a $10,000 bill. So just by inflation, inflation is a way they wage the war on cash too, because it devalues the largest bill, and then they don't issue another larger bill. So if they really wanted to be honest and keep the purchasing power constant at the 1960s or so levels, when they really phased out the larger bills, they'd really have to issue something like a $500 bill to keep pace with the inflation. It's so no, I don't see the war on cash slowing down. I see it heating up, actually, because of what you mentioned. It's global. The war on cash is global, but it's heating up. You can see it in India. You can see it in Venezuela. And the real impetus for the war on cash to prop up the banking system, it also allows the bankers to go to negative interest rates, which is just another confiscation gimmick wrapped in textbook economic sounding complicated language, but really it's just a fancy way to confiscate wealth. So all of the reasons why they need to, or why they think they need to pursue the war on cash, are still there and still growing. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any evidence that Trump would reverse that.
Yeah, I disagree with Danielle DiMartino Booth. I think she's, apologizing for some of the Fed's behavior there. I think she's too optimistic about some of these academics. Even though she wasn't an academic, she had a finance background and worked on Wall Street. There's not a lot of people at the Federal Reserve who are not PhD Keynesian economists who have never even had a real world job. So most of these guys, are academics. They have PhDs in economics and econometrics and statistics. A lot of them haven't even worked on Wall Street. A lot of them have, multiple pensions from academia. So they don't really care about the real world that much. They care about, sticking to blind ideologies. You brought up the inherent instability of fractional reserve banking. I've read a few Murray Rothbard books, and one of the things Murray Rothbard talks about with his history of banking and his basic introduction on what government has done to our money, he talks about fractional reserve banking and how inherently unstable it is. And basically, depending upon, the reserve ratios on fractional reserve lending, all the banks are different degrees of insolvent. So then when you add on, all these crazy derivatives that don't have to have collateral, and then you let the banks do these fractional reserve lending ratios, these crazy ones. I believe in 2008, Nick, the fractional reserve lending ratio, the banks had less than 1% reserves in the bank. So yeah, that's how crazy. 2008, the banks had, I think, 0.01%. So they were levered, some of them 80 to 1 or more. So people are talking about the crazy leverage ratios of Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers. That was just some of their assets that they were leveraged on. I mean, their other loans, they were leveraged like crazy. So things have just gone crazy. That people don't understand the inherently unstable nature of fractional reserve lending from these large banks, and how, the central banks are there basically to print unlimited amounts of money. I agree with you about inflation. So, if you're watching Bloomberg or CNBC, and then you have guys like Larry Summers and Ken Rogoff who are still on doing interviews talking about how, we need to go to cashless society, we need to have digital to track and tax every transaction. But, I don't think the government, and we have the talking heads screaming about deflation about everything. I don't think the government is going to allow deflation for a long period of time because, they can't tax it. So,
well, no, I think you're completely right. I think under a fiat, this is what, it's the eternal debate between inflation and deflation. And I'll tell you why. I think, deflation might win initially, but I personally think inflation will always win in the end in a fiat money system, because there's no limit to what the currency the government can create. It's not like in the 1930s in the Great Depression when there was a gold standard and they couldn't create enough. I mean, that's not the reason there was a Great Depression. I mean, that's the reason they tell you in the history books, but let's not open it. Well, we'll save that for another discussion. But the fact is that they were on a gold standard, so they couldn't create them. There could be deflation because they were limited in the amount of money they could create. Now there is no limit to the amount of currency they can create. So I think ultimately, whenever a government gets into that kind of a situation, of course they're going to choose to print. And that's why inflation will always win out in a fiat money system.
Yeah, I agree. In the long term, yes, that's definitely what's going to happen. Even if loans fail, what's to stop them from creating new SDR units and new credit units, or doing bailouts with the central banks, just creating, digital euros or digital yen or more digital dollars, buy up the bad assets. Oh, the banks, oh, sorry, you made bad loans, bad investments. We're not going to throw you in jail for fraud or anything like that. Here's, trillions of dollars. We're going to buy up your bad assets, and we're going to give you good newly created digital currency units on your balance sheets.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the system is inherently fraudulent, and there is fraud baked into the cake of a fiat money system and a fractional reserve system. I mean, really, if let's say you took those concepts into a industry other than banking. Let's say you owned a storage facility, because a bank is just a storage facility for your money at least, or your currency. Well, let's say you had a storage unit where people would come and they'd store their furniture or they'd store their belongings. And let's say, you started loaning that out to a higher level than there was actual furniture in those storage units. I mean, that's the same. I mean, that's obvious. You're loaning something out you don't have, essentially, is what the banks are doing. And that is inherently fraudulent.
Yeah, I completely agree. And most people don't understand any of this. If you tried to tell a guy on the street that, if you wanted to take out a certain amount of money, you went to the bank and the bank might not have it, they would look at you like you had three eyes. So,
yeah, that's a problem. Most people are completely oblivious to this, and most people who are somewhat even dimly aware of it think, oh, the FDIC or the deposit insurance has my back. But the fact of the matter is that the deposit insurance, I think last I checked, they really cover only 2 cents on the dollar of everything they're supposed to insure. And it would only take a couple of medium-sized bank failures to wipe out their whole reserve fund. So it's really a false sense of security, too. So that's one thing, too, is that people don't understand the enormous risks that are inherent in the banking system. And they think it's, this is one of the biggest misconceptions of the average person. They conflate they think having cash under their mattress is the same thing as putting it into a bank and having it in a bank account. They think, oh, it's both cash, it's both mine. But really, it's not the case at all. Once you deposit money into the bank, it's not your asset anymore. It's the bank's asset, and what you own instead is an unsecured liability. So if the bank gets in trouble, well, guess what? You're screwed. And it could when you point out how leveraged these institutions are, it wouldn't take much for these banks to get in trouble. So there's a lot of risk into this system that most people don't even put two thoughts into.
Yeah, and the banks publicly traded financial statements after the 2008 financial crash. One of the reasons the bank stocks took off and there was a quote-unquote, fake recovery with the asset prices moving higher, besides the quantitative easing programs, the banks were allowed to mark their assets whatever they wanted to. So if you're looking at which banks you think are more leveraged than others and are more dangerous, it's even tougher to tell nowadays because the banks are legally allowed. Unlike other corporations and other industries, they can use fraudulent accounting. They can mark their assets to whatever they want to and lie about their financial ratios. So, try getting a lot of people who work in the financial industry to even admit this. I've tried asking people about CNBC who recommend bank stocks about this, and they'll admit that, yeah, the banks are allowed to use fraudulent accounting, but then they'll say, oh, bank stocks are still a good buy.
It blows the mind.
I want to ask you about Thomas Piketty. His book has been talked about the last couple years. It's for our listeners not familiar, it's come out about 2 years ago, I believe. He's French. I call him a neo-Marxist. He kind of makes Paul Krugman look pretty tame. He wrote about how governments all over the world need to unite so they can enforce a global wealth tax to stop tax dodgers. So, the really rich, successful people should be paying, 5%, 10% per year in asset taxes if they try to move their assets from one country to another. It looks like, this seems to be part of the globalist plan for wealth redistribution. What's your opinion on this?
Oh, sure. It's completely abhorrent, and it just shows you the totalitarian nature of how these people think. First, yes, and it is disturbing because his ideas are just awful, and they're gaining traction. I've heard him also described as the new John Maynard Keynes, and that's not a compliment. So we'll see where this is going. That certainly would be the goal of the elites and the globalists, but I don't know if it's going to happen to coordinate the whole world's tax policies and so forth and information exchanges. There's been some very big moves in that direction, but it's never been done before. And that it just might be a bridge too far for these people. I think the jury is still out on that. It's very disturbing. It's very possible, but it's not. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's inevitable. It's possible, though.
We do have more people waking up, Nick, that are aware that there are problems in the society. Unfortunately, a lot of them, tend to lean towards the Bernie Sanders solution where, oh, they blame capitalism. Oh, it's all the bankers' faults. Obviously, the banks played a very big part, and the central banks played a very big part in creating the 2008 financial crisis, but politicians also deserve a large part of the blame. There was the Community Reinvestment Act that the politicians passed, which forced bankers to make loans that the bankers knew would go bad, and that fueled the subprime bubble. The Community Reinvestment Act grew like crazy starting in Jimmy Carter, and then grew like crazy under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. It just grew and grew and grew. So, I mean, the people out there who are saying that, if we just eliminate capitalism and we throw all the bankers in jail, although, if the bankers are committing fraud, they should be in jail. They're manipulating gold and silver and other markets, but not all bankers are bad. But what's your opinion, though, of the people that, identify some of the problems in society and then they point to that Bernie Sanders and some of his ideas are a solution?
Well, I think with all these things and with everything in life, it always helps to start by first defining your terms, because if we don't agree on what we're talking about, then we don't know what we're talking about by definition. So I think what a lot of these people confuse with capitalism, these Bernie Sanders guys, and maybe they're well-intentioned, but I think they confuse capitalism with economic fascism. And that might sound like a shocking word to a lot of listeners, but really it's an accurate word. I mean, fascism has more to do with the government and big business getting together than people in jackboots marching down the street. I mean, certainly that's the image that comes to mind, but really fascism is just the partnership of state and corporate power. Very simple. So when you look at entities like Goldman Sachs and these big banks and Lockheed Martin and the health insurance and all these, big businesses that are in bed with the government, that's not capitalism. That's strictly economic fascism. So I would agree with those Bernie Sanders folks and saying, hey, there's a problem here. But I would disagree with diagnosing it as a problem of capitalism, which is simply the voluntary, free market, which I think is a very good thing. It's just that its name has been so much dragged through the mud, and that people don't know what they're don't when they say capitalism, the average person doesn't know what it means. So it's unfortunate that people from the pro-freedom people like yourself and myself have so far lost the battle to because you gotta can't use the enemy's terms. We've lost the battle to define the terms. They've defined economic fascism as capitalism, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, a lot of people, when I ask them, like men on the street, not libertarians or people who know the Austrian School of Economics, even people from business school, when I ask them what capitalism is, they tend to give me, the Marxist term of it or the Keynesian term of it, that, government has to be involved in regulating the economy, we have to have a central bank, we have to have all these different government programs, not realizing that, before the Department of Education was created, the U.S. actually had way better students testing globally in math and science. So, I mean, the education that people received before that was just fine, where there was private schools offered, there was affordable private schools due to competition. So, yeah, I think, what most people don't understand who support Bernie Sanders, they identify the problems, but their solution is we need to go socialism, or we need to end, money is the root of all evil, these ridiculous things. But I think, we need to get back to free markets and competition. We need the taxes cut, because the problem right now in the economy in the U.S. is there's just not a lot of jobs out there. There's part-time jobs, but it's, people can barely make a living. So I think, long-term solution, people have to really figure out that capitalism is all about saving and investment and job creation and value creation, new products and services, and, not these definitions that they're being told by their professor, their textbook, or what the media says. and how capitalism is bad. But I think most of the economy, Nick, in the United States, also in Europe, since you've traveled a lot more than me, I think it's been turned into cartels. You know, the Federal Reserve's a cartel. We have the FDA and the large pharmaceutical companies creating cartels. And people mistake these cartels, which is, you know, what you call fascism, cartels, basically the same thing. People think that is capitalism, and it's really not.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. So, unfortunately, it's hard to talk to a lot of these people when they don't even we don't even have a common agreement on the terms we're talking about.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, and you know, this is why I do videos about Keynesian economics, and people are like, "Why are you bashing Keynesian economics?" Because Keynesian economics and people looking at the economy through a Marxist lens or Keynesian lens, they don't really understand what's going on because of the definitions. I mean, Keynes has distorted so many things. Keynes, we've had basically 100 years, almost 100 years now of Keynesian economics. It'll be 100 years soon, and really, you know, it's done a lot more harm than good. And in spite of that, we've had some innovation in some industries, but you know, it's destroyed the middle class. It's created a society that consumes, that can't afford to consume, that's, you know, borrowing on tremendous amounts of credit and can't pay it back. And Keynes says that's good for the economy. And you know, now with the manipulation of interest rates, we're getting to these ridiculous experiments playing out, whether it's Zimbabwe or Venezuela, finally in India now, where they're either banning cash or they're banning gold. So it's just totally destroying freedom at this point. I think, you know, the governments are desperate for tax revenues and they're desperate for more power. So things may get worse in the short term before they get better, but I think more people are waking up to the problems.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think too that you know, another area where we've lost the war of words is that Keynesian economics is simply economics for most people. They don't know the difference between Keynesian. It's just simply economics, especially for people who have gone through university and so forth. You know, standard economics courses. So that's an interesting note as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. They're not even taught, you know, they're not even taught monetarism or the Chicago school, the difference of that. They're not even taught the difference of all the different economic schools out there. So, you know, it's just like, here's Keynes's work, and it's basically the Bible. And then, you know, when I took a couple basic undergraduate level courses, I was learning Keynes and Marx. So,
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but yeah, no, you're right. Austrian economics is growing. The understanding of it is growing, especially among young people. So I think there is some cause for optimism. Certainly, Ron Paul did a lot to bring these ideas forward to millions of people. So there's definitely some hope in that.
yeah, I agree. And Ron Paul actually got one one electoral vote. So he when he had run for president in the past, he hadn't gotten one. So that's at least good that he got one. My last question for you has to do with internationalizing either your citizenship or your assets. A lot of my listeners out there, some of them are very high net worth, some of them are not. What do you think are basic steps to people then who don't have millions of dollars but are looking to maybe add a second passport or start diversifying their assets into other countries? What are some basic steps that they can take then if they don't have a high net worth yet?
Sure, and let me just say that this is completely these things you're talking about is completely different than globalism. It's something that people also conflate with globalism, but it's actually the opposite of globalism. Is, you know, internationally diversifying yourself, because it allows you to remove the control that various politicians have over you in different countries. In essence, you are getting rid of their power over you. So it is a very different thing than globalism. So, and I think it's a good thing to lessen the ability of politicians to exercise power over you. So how do you do that? You diversify different aspects of your life. You diversify your citizenship by having multiple citizenship, multiple passports. That way, no particular government owns you. You know, the U.S. government can take away your passport for any number of reasons, for a felony, for example. And there is a really good book written recently by a very good lawyer about how there are so many laws on the books that the average American commits inadvertently 3 felonies a day. So really what that means is that the U.S. government could take away your passport or your citizenship for any reason they wanted to. So, and if you don't have another passport or citizenship, well, you're really out of luck in that kind of a situation. But it's not just the U.S. Any country can do that. So it's always good to have more options, and a second passport gives you so many more options. It gives you, the legal right to live and work in another country, and so forth. So it makes sure you're not put under house arrest if your other government takes away your other passport. So it's a very, very important thing to get. You do this also with your money. If you can bank in other countries, for example, the banks in Singapore and Hong Kong. We were talking about the banking system earlier, and unfortunately, there's really nowhere in the world where you can find sound banking. It's a matter of finding the least unsound banking systems in the world. In Hong Kong and Singapore, are about the least unsound banking systems in the world. So by putting your money in, say, a Hong Kong bank or a Singapore bank, it's out of the immediate reach of the U.S. government. They can't just flip a switch and confiscate it or freeze it or anything like that, or do a bail-in or a deposit tax or whatever. So that's another aspect, is moving some of your assets in different countries. Your business, of course, you can hope some people can structure it that way. And your digital presence, you can have obviously Google and Yahoo are in bed with the U.S. government, also sort of entities of that partnership between big government and big business that we don't like. But you can open an email account in Switzerland or in Iceland where there is real privacy protection, or you can open like a cloud online storage type thing in a foreign country that has real privacy protection. Anyways, the point is to move different aspects of your life, spread them around the world, and diversify the political risk. And some of the ways you can do that, you don't necessarily need to have a lot of money. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a dual citizen of Italy, and that's how I obtained my second passport and second citizenship, was through Italy, and that didn't cost much money. You do have to, I had ancestry in Italy and was able to apply for that citizenship and obtain it. All under, cost a couple $100. Didn't cost much at all. So, if you're lucky to have ancestry in certain countries, certainly Italy and Ireland are the easiest. Poland, Portugal, Greece, a lot of European countries allow for this. So if you have European heritage or heritage in other countries, you should explore that, because you might be eligible to receive dual citizenship. Likewise, you can diversify. It doesn't take much to get. People think you need millions of dollars to have an offshore foreign bank account. Not necessarily. You can get them for much lower amounts, under $1,000 in certain cases in various countries around the world. So that's the way you can do that. Of course, one of the simplest ways to remove the political risk to yourself is to simply buy gold and silver. Gold and silver are no government fully controls gold and silver. So by transferring your fiat money into a gold coin, which is accepted in any country around the world, or a silver coin, which is likewise accepted anywhere around the world, you're also internationalizing your savings, because that's international money. So that, I think, is the easiest way you can do it.
Yeah, Bitcoin also adds to that too. You can walk some of your wealth now with a memory stick, across the border. So
yes.
Yeah,
yes.
So that's another option. I'm not saying anyone should go out there and put all their money into Bitcoin, but if you're in India or if you're in Venezuela, you can, and you need to move some money, you can move it out with Bitcoin a lot quicker than, say, some of the other options available. But the people in the U.S. who are saying this won't happen to the U.S., India was supposedly pro-gold. There was a $250,000 a year max limit, I think, on how much capital can be moved out of India if you're an Indian citizen. But from reading articles from someone living in India, it appears now, the government's about to enforce a lot harsher capital controls. Now when you deposit more money at the bank in India, and they forced a lot of more money back into the banks, I think they forced 92% of all the currency that was outstanding back into the banking system with these new demonetization and capital controls. People panicked and there was long lines. Hundreds of people have already starved. Businesses are grinding to a halt because, it was a cash economy. People in India weren't using their check cards or smartphones to pay like they are in the US or Europe or Canada. So and now India is looking at basically, I think they've put in a penalty on gold too. So they basically made it very hard to either import gold or to hold on to gold, because they're just looking at taxing anything that grabs. So they're trying to go full cashless and full digital. And a lot of the people there don't view the world, Nick, the way you and I do. A lot of the people in India, from what I was hearing, they're part of the middle class bureaucracy there that'll do almost anything the government tells them to do.
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate, because this is really a horrible move that Modi did, the Prime Minister of India, and he did it like a robber in the middle of the night, taking people by surprise on the election day in the U.S. This all started, remember, on November 8th, when everybody was obsessed with the American election. So he did it in a sneak attack, ambush style, on his people, who should have given him the Mussolini treatment, to be quite honest, because what he did is blatant theft. It's totalitarian control. It's horrible stuff. This is horrible stuff, and it's really strange. We feel like I live in a bizarro world, that instead of reading condemnations of Modi in, say, the mainstream media, you read praise for him, as if he's some sort of reformer or visionary. I mean, it's quite strange.
Yeah, the world we're living in now, with The Economist magazine and so many of these other mainstream Keynesian publications, they want to go negative interest rates. They want more government control over the money supply. You brought up inflation earlier. It seems to me they want to track and tax every single transaction. So once they go cashless, which limits freedom, they have gold and silver here in the U.S. taxed very higher. They're trying to say, oh, you can pay on your smartphone, it's more convenient. But then on top of that, I think going forward, Nick, once they have everything in the digital economy, in the banking system, they could start to layer on even more taxes, like a VAT tax, and every single economic transaction, even if I'm giving you $20 because you paid for lunch for me, the government would layer on an extra VAT tax on it for me paying you back. It seems that's the way things are going, unfortunately.
Well, sure, and once it's cashless, I mean, we could talk for days. Unfortunately, the possibilities are limitless for them to concoct new ways to confiscate wealth. But I think you also raised a good point about gold. If there is the war on cash, I mean, the war on gold is not far behind if they're really looking to control this stuff. It's just, I think they haven't really gone after gold, at least in the U.S., because it's different than India, where they do have a culture of owning gold. There's not that culture in the U.S. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the YouTube videos of the guy walking around trying to sell somebody a gold coin at face value, a 1-ounce gold coin at face value, and nobody will buy it. Nobody will buy it. Or he tries to buy like a Happy Meal at McDonald's with a gold coin and not ask for any change, and they don't even know what it is. So, I mean,
did you see that's Mark Dice. Did you see the people who chose a chocolate bar over a 100-ounce bar of silver instead, and he was going to let them go into the coin shop to to show that the silver bar was legit?
Yeah, I did see that. It's sad and funny at the same time, but I think it also illustrates that if there's going to be I don't think there will be another confiscation of gold as there was in, say, the 30s, because the average American just doesn't own gold, and second, doesn't even understand what it is. So that I don't think it's going to happen. I think the war on gold will take a different form, possibly a windfall profits tax, which is very possible.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility as well. But yeah, I mean, the U.S.'s culture for gold and silver, it used to be a gold and silver country, but, starting in the 30s, that stopped because they started teaching Keynesian economics hardcore amounts, and, the government started getting rid of the gold standard with FDR, and then, Lyndon B. Johnson took the silver coinage out. So after that, they basically stopped teaching about anything positive about gold and silver. So, the U.S. used to be pro gold and silver, but it's definitely not that way anymore. I think, the country is going to, you can't really save in digital fiat currencies anymore. You can't put a lot of money in the bank account. You're not getting any interest rates really on it. And then, your purchasing power is being devalued long term. So
it is. And another thing to add too is that all these so-called economists, they say, oh, we need 2% inflation, as if 2% is this magic number of inflation. But actually, any inflation is deadly poisonous, because if you look at the compounding effects of, say, 2% inflation over 20 years, that erodes a large part of your capital. It's really a horrible thing that anybody would advocate for any inflation. It's stealing purchasing power from savers. It's a horrible thing.
Yeah, the government's war on gold, I forgot my other point, I just remembered it now. I mean, the government's war on gold, they manipulate the paper gold and silver price, so that's part of the war on gold. They don't teach about any positives of gold and silver. That's another part of it in the school system. The other part is the way gold and silver are already taxed. So, I mean, gold and silver are already taxed really horribly. You can't lock in any long-term capital gains tax. So if you bought silver when it was $4 an ounce 12 years ago, you don't get any benefit from buying and holding the silver longer and longer and then maybe selling it sometime in the future. You don't lock in a lower tax rate like you do with other asset classes. So the government has, already with the tax system made it punitive to hold gold and silver because when you do go to sell, it's taxed as ordinary income. So basically, the more the government inflates, they've already thought of this, they can wipe away a lot of your nominal gains.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, Nick. Well, I enjoyed our discussion. I could probably talk with you for a lot longer, but I'm not sure if our listeners would want to listen for over an hour about you and me rambling about all the stupidity that the governments and politicians and central bankers are doing. If our listeners want to read more of your articles, how do they do so?
Well, the easiest way to do that is on internationalman.com, and we have a lot of great free videos that kind of continue the discussion that we've been having on these various topics, and I think they would really appreciate them, and they're at internationalman.com if they'd like to check them out.
Great, and your work is also featured on Zero Hedge, so our listeners, I'm sure, have seen your work over there as well.
Yeah, that fake news site, Zero Hedge. Yes, no, I'm kidding. I'm joking.
Well, yeah, I have like a handful of friends who were actually like listed in that fake news on the fake news list. So that was an interesting couple days hearing from my friends about that.
Oh yes.
I think the Washington Post was risking getting sued, so I think they did issue some type of lame retraction. But if they try anything like that that again, there's definitely going to be some very serious lawsuits.
Yes, and it's really, I mean, anybody who has a couple of brain cells should be able to see through this. It's just a fraud, the fake news thing. I mean, they're obviously throwing in alternative media sources. They're lumping them in with other things that they don't belong to be lumped in with as a way to try to retain their credibility, because of the mainstream media. The credibility of the mainstream media is at record lows, according to Gallup, which tracks this kind of stuff. So it's at all-time historical lows, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, the mainstream media is a horrible institute. They're horrible institutions. Again, it's that partnership between big government and big business. But this time, I think it's even more toxic because it really infects the brains and the thinking of a lot of people. So anything that does away with the mainstream media, I'm all for.
Yeah, and it's important for the media to challenge the government and call them out, and we haven't really had that. In the past, the media used to not be as politically biased as it is right now. I think the media now the majority of them are not more than just the majority. I think 90% of them are registered Democrats now, which if you look at the numbers from decades ago, it was never skewed quite this much. So I think, the mainstream, in the past, the media would challenge the government more, whatever they said, and would do investigative journalism, and we don't really have that now anymore.
Unfortunately, you're right. We don't.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your time, Nick, and we'll have you back on in the future. Unfortunately, Nick, I think there's going to be more current events coming out and more crazy, stupid politicians. The poor Cubans, they did have Fidel Castro, who was, an oppressor. He did pass away, but, it doesn't look like in the short term that things are going to get better for a lot of the Cubans. So, unfortunately, I think a lot of these governments, things are going to get worse. Maduro is currently still, despite, their hyperinflation and all that, he's still blaming Obama and the U.S. for all the problems in the government, even though, Chavez and Maduro created a lot of that as well.
Oh, sure. It's a, classic case of blaming problems on other people. And that's actually the perverse nature of the Cuban embargo, which was a perfect justification for Fidel because what it did is it helped the people it was intending to hurt and hurt the people it was intending to help. Because what did it do? It was a perfect justification for Castro because he could blame all the problems on the embargo and make it look like nothing was his fault. So, I mean, yeah. Anyways, that's another topic. But yeah, of course, governments point the finger. They never take responsibility, and they never do. So we shouldn't be surprised at that.
Yeah, the embargo went up because the Castro government stole $6 billion worth of assets from, U.S. corporations, private U.S. citizens, and the Italian mafia. So, I mean, the Castro stole all those assets, like what Chavez and Maduro have done in that country, and the Soviets with Lenin and Stalin did with any private assets in that country. So, yeah, it was justification and excuse and propaganda spin. This is what governments are good at, man. I don't know why so many people still have faith in politicians and governments when there's just, thousands of years of evidence of lying and murdering and corruption from so many different governments.
Yes, it's true, and that is a sad track record, but it is an accurate track record. And thankfully there are people like you out there spreading the truth, so people can become educated on these issues and protect themselves and learn about the true nature of the world and take actions to protect themselves, and that's very important.